Hello and welcome to another virtual author event at the Poison Pen Bookstore. I'm John Charles, and today the Poison Pen is honored to have with us award-winning author John Copenhaver, whose new book is Hall of Mirrors. Before we begin today, for those tuning in, the Poison Pen does have a limited number of signed copies of John's new book, and we would be happy to hold one for you or put one in the mail. As soon as the program is over, just give us a call or go online to the Poison Pen Bookstore. Now I'd like to welcome in author John Copenhaver.
Thank you for having me. It's really wonderful to be here, John.
Thank you for joining us today. My first question as a reader is I'm always fascinated by who the author is outside of being a writer, and you have a rather colorful background. So, can you tell me about who John is outside of being an author?
Yeah, absolutely. I spent many years teaching at the secondary level. I now teach at VCU, which is Virginia Commonwealth University here in Richmond, Virginia, where I live. And also I teach in an MFA program at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, but it's low residency, so I'm not like living there. I'm just going back and forth a couple of times a year. But teaching is a huge part of who I am, and an important part of who I am. And I think sometimes that bleeds into my writing a little bit. Even the book before this had a major sort of teacher character in it. So, that plays a big role in a lot of the writing that I do, and certainly has kind of I think there are little, maybe even subtler ways that it makes it into what I do. But other than that, I'm a Virginia native, and I lived in DC for many years and have only recently moved to Richmond, Virginia for a slightly slower pace of life and to be near my elderly mother. But like it's kind of nice to take a step back from the city craziness.
Yeah, DC has a different kind of energy, that's for sure. Um,
Absolutely.
when did you decide you wanted to write novels, and can we really blame everything on Hanna-Barbera?
I did. So yeah, a little bit, maybe not entirely. I think that I got hooked on mystery fiction, particularly because I loved the sort of the unveiling. There's something about that. And I think the truth is that even in literary fiction, if in terms of character, I think there's often an unveiling as well. Of course, in mystery fiction, I think there's both an unveiling of the who did it, but also in great mystery fiction, I think, and why did it is equally important. In other words, what is it about the character that you had not seen before that's so compelling? So I think that was kind of always there. I think just the idea of expressing myself through stories actually, I think, predates my thinking about writing them in fiction. I used to like do elaborate comic book kind of narratives, and then like I got into D&D in the 80s. I was a child of the 80s and early 90s, and so I was like the dungeon master and always creating all these adventures for my friends, and I like creating them. I didn't like the prefab adventures. I wanted to do it myself, So there's like, and then I started making movies with friends, and they were all murder mysteries, like sort of Agatha Christie inspired murder mysteries. And I was like, maybe I just need to stop torturing all my friends and write a story, start writing in fiction. And I started that early in high school. And then I never really looked back. I've always been writing fiction. And at some point in my MFA program, folks were like, John, all your stories sound like they should be novels. I was like, well, maybe I need to start writing novels. And so that's why I love writing novels, and I still find writing short stories very difficult. So
Wow.
I think it's just expansive kind of imagination or something.
When you chose to write your first novel, which was Dodging and Burning, I think in many ways it's kind of a lesson in hope for aspiring writers because you were not an overnight publishing sensation.
No, I was not. And I think it's very important to remember that I would venture to say for most of us, the story of making your way to publishing is one of like a lot of patience and a lot of persistence and a lot of, taking rejection and fighting your way through and making connections. It's not just writing a great book. I mean, you have to do that, which is enough work. And it took me, like when I started Dodging and Burning, like keep in mind I was teaching full time, so I was really working in the summers. And this was when I was teaching high school, so it was very hard to write during the school year. It took me about 10 years total from the moment of sort of I got the idea to when it was in bookstores. And it took me a couple years to find an agent. Once I'd finished, about 3 years to write the novel, a couple years to find an agent, like 3 years to sell it, which I had not planned on. I thought once you get an agent, you're like, oh, it's just a matter of time, and then suddenly, and you find out that no, this is a whole nother part of the adventure of publishing. But if you stick with it, and you stay true to like what your vision of a writer is, I think it can be it's very satisfying, of course, when it does happen. But patience and persistence are key.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So you finally did get published, and that led to your second book. And we want to talk about your new book, but we actually have to begin with the savage kind because you introduce us to characters that appear in Hall of Mirrors.
Yeah, I do. In fact, The Savage Kind is the first book in the sort of trilogy that I've planned. And Hall of Mirrors, of course, is the second. And the major characters in that book play important roles in Hall of Mirrors, particularly Judy, who's Judy Peabody, becomes Judy Nightingale, and then Philippa Watson. And they are two teenage girls, and it's 1948. It's a historical sort of twist on the femme fatale mystery, but it's 1948 in Savage Kind. And these two girls kind of find each other. They're very different. It's kind of a case of opposites attract. And they, kind of they start to fall in love with each other. They don't recognize it at first. It just is a friendship at first. But they're particularly focused on their English teacher, who's this sort of glamorous Miss Martins. And when things go wrong with Miss Martins, they start solving the kind of figuring out why she's changed. And a classmate dies, and they get wrapped up in a mystery that turns out to sort of reveal things about themselves as well. And so a lot of those threads in that mystery then kind of wind their way into Hall of Mirrors, and will continue to sort of be woven through the final book. Because I just had more to say about these characters. I didn't realize that at first, but I just had a lot to say about them. So they continue to kind of reveal themselves to me.
You say it is kind of your nod or your homage to the femme fatale, a classic iconic figure in noir crime fiction. Do you think
Yeah.
that we've gotten that character wrong? I mean, I sometimes think that a parallel analysis would be if a woman is strong in business and she's leading a corporation and she's doing things, basically a lot of people call her a bitch. But if it was a man, they'd think he's Elon Musk or someone.
Right. Yeah, I was very much interested into tapping into several things about that figure of the femme fatale. I mean, of course, the traditional, well, I'll back up a little bit in my relationship to that character because I have always loved the femme fatales. I mean, I think they tend to be beloved characters, but I was like, why am I so attracted to these great sort of these beautiful actresses playing these very villainous roles? And I don't so much think, I don't watch to hate them. I watch because I want them to win, you know? And they usually get punished because of the Hays Code, right? They're always getting punished. And it always feels unfortunate to me because in my mind, they're often, because of some of the skill, the writing and the skill of the actresses portraying them, they're trying to convey a kind of agency. Like they want some power in this world that's very male dominated, and they're treated poorly ultimately, or even sometimes have to scheme to get that power. But the men are doing the same things, right?
Mhm.
And so I thought, well, what if we kind of look at their like a femme fatale, like these, in my case, it's Judy and Philip. Like, what if we look at their origin story and we look at young women during this time period who are smart and who are creative and queer in this case too, and like give them like a story of their attempt to grasp and grab at some agency and humanize that story a bit. So yeah, it's like a character. I think even if you watch those great film noir with a certain lens, you can kind of see that coming through. You could probably because the female actresses playing these roles are bringing it to those performances. They're like, yeah, there's more here, and I'm going to just like I'm going to pull it through since it's not necessarily in the storyline. I'm going to add this layer to the dialogue, and those for some reason I think has always I've always felt compelled by that character, and I think that's also because my mom is that generation, and I saw her as she's a very bright, very capable woman, but was told, 1950s housewife, mother, that's what's slotted for you. And I'm not so sure that's necessarily what she would have chosen for herself, but that was society. And that's, I think that's a story of a lot of women from that time period.
Which brings us to your new book, Hall of Mirrors. What can you tell us about that book?
Yeah, so besides being a kind of deepening of Judy and Philippa's journey, in this case, Hall of Mirror takes them to 1954, and they're now young women, and they're sort of now kind of finally really acknowledging that they are in a relationship. But it's a very tricky environment in which to be in a same-sex relationship. Not to mention that Judy is, mixed race and trying to work out. She passes as white, so trying to work out how she lives and exists in the world. But the mystery actually has to do with two other characters who sort of serve as foil and are incredibly important to the story, and that's Lionel Kane and Roger Raymond. And they actually make an appearance in a way in Savage Kind because they are a writing duo who write under a single pseudonym named Ray Kane. And Ray Kane is these Judy and Philippa is one of their favorite hard-boiled mystery authors. So there are these two men. They are also they're a gay couple, mixed race gay couple, and they're writing underneath this sort of straight, masculine, hard-boiled pseudonym. And the story begins with Roger being booted from the State Department as part of this was a subset of the Red Scare called the Lavender Scare, where gay men and women were booted from the State Department because of their sexuality. The idea is that they could be blackmailed and that, and then, state secrets could be extracted from, communist spies. That rarely happened. And when it did, they didn't extract many good, important secrets. So a lot of it was about political leveraging on the part of Joseph McCarthy and others to sort of use fear to, great gain power, which is a familiar, familiar method. We see it play today. And so, but what happens is that Roger dies in a fire, and the cops say it's suicide, and Lionel says that's not, he doesn't believe it. And he teams up with Judy and Philippa to try to solve the crime and figure out what actually happened. So, it's a murder mystery, but it's also a lot about, the environment in the 1950s in Washington, D.C.
You kind of hint at that. Early on in the book, there's a wonderful scene at a bookstore, Printano's, where Judy and Philippa are there to see their favorite author, Ray, who says during his talk, at their core, crime novels embrace duality. Two stories are being told. And that's kind of what you're doing with Hall of Mirrors.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there's all this there's always two stories at play. There's the story of the past and the story of the present. And that's true particularly for crime fiction. I think it's true for all fiction, but I think particularly crime fiction, particularly mystery fiction, when an event has occurred and you're trying to unravel what led up to that event, you're telling these two things. But there's also two stories. We've got two characters and two stories going on at the same time, two sets of characters. and they ultimately in the center of the novel we get a long scene where they cross paths, and they're all together, and there's a lot sort of in that scene, but there's a lot of narrative threads that are echoing and speaking to one another throughout the story. And I think I certainly had fun writing that, and there's all this sort of metaphorical potential of all that, and it's film noir doubling and mirroring is a big part of film noir, which I, of course, if it's not obvious already, love. So that's echoing here too.
Yeah, it kind of made me have to go back to high school and I had to think about literature and stuff like that when you do all of those mirror references because Judy and Philippe are seeing themselves mirrored in Lionel and Roger. There's references to other characters and mirrors. I think at one point you mentioned movies like Lady of Shanghai and the mirror scene in
Yeah,
there for that.
yeah.
So did you know from the beginning this is what I want to frame the story around, this whole idea of reflections and are you seeing the real person and things like that?
Yeah, I did. It's really interesting. I had the title right almost right off the bat,
Mm.
and um, I think I've been watching a lot of noir and thinking about doubles, and then thinking also about identity and how people kind of judge a book by its cover, or they draw conclusions based on what they see. And I mean, of course, I think it's a long-standing kind of metaphorical trope in crime fiction because people are always concealing their true identities, right, or their true motivations. But what the kind of twist I wanted to give it a little bit here is that in these characters' cases, both with the two men writing under a straight white pseudonym and then Judy passing as white. I wanted to play with the idea that sometimes people must conceal themselves to survive. If they can conceal themselves, but they have to conceal themselves to survive in a culture that doesn't particularly want to give them power or agency and maybe wants to take it away from them. So it's sort of like in one case, yes, there's dubiousness, but in some cases you have to lie, deceive to survive. And I wanted to play around with those two things in the book.
One of the other things you kind of explore in Hall of Mirrors is the power of books. Because in the case of Judy, reading books saves her. In the case of Lionel, writing books saves him.
Yeah, yeah. I think this is where my teacher is always coming in, and my lover of books,
Mm.
um, and my desire to convey a love of books because I think books do have great power to for all what in many different ways. I don't think it's a singular kind of power. Sometimes they teach us something about ourselves. Sometimes they're about like relieving stress by escaping into something, I think they're healing. I think one thing that keeps on occurring to me more and more these days is that bringing people together over discussing books, whether it's a book group or an event or even just you and I talking here, it's vital to us as humans, and I think it makes us. It's there's something about it's always healing. And I think we live in this world of social media, shouting and sound bites, and it's pushing us apart. And I think books and stories, can pull us together. So I think I'm always trying to slip that in. Hopefully it's not too like, over knocking folks over the head. But I think because the characters are passionate about books, it's not hard to do.
Yeah.
And that's consistent from the first novel. The two girls are just crazy about books.
Yeah, and I think it's an indication of the times we're in that people think books are so powerful, they try to keep some people from reading them in certain cases.
Yep. That's a real indicator that there's like an acknowledgement of their power. And that even to sort of to provide a door to self-discovery or discovery of other people. It's not always just about yourself, but that is scary to some people. And so book banning and that kind of thing emerges, and it's terrible for us. It's isolating, and I always when you get people together talking, you have more in common than you don't. And I think that's books can kind of bring people together in that way. So yeah, the love of books, it's embedded somewhat metafictionally in my books.
All three of your novels are historical mysteries in a sense, so you have to do research about the time period. You also have to know how much to bring in to evoke that particular era and how much to leave out because you don't want to overwhelm the reader. Can you talk a little bit about researching the late 40s, the early 50s? Were there particular sources that you used to try to bring that sense of authenticity to the stories, and what did you discover about this time period that surprised you the most?
Yeah, so several things. I mean, first of all, to kind of give you the bird's eye view, and this really started with my first novel, Dodging and Burning. Um, I I found that there's an enormous amount of material. Just before I mention that, give you a little context. Dodging and Burning is set at the end of the Second World War, so I'm dealing with the war directly. It centers around a gay war photographer. Anyway, like I did a lot of research. There's tons of research to be had about the Second World War, but about LGBTQ life at that time, there's so little. So it was like this mountain of things that I could look at for the Second World War and post-war era, and then there's just so little. And so what happened is that generally, like, I had to figure out what to sort of take from one side, and then on the other side, I had to use my best sense of cobbling together some scraps of information to then use my imagination and fill in the gaps a little bit, which is one of the powerful things about historical fiction. um, but when it comes to actually like writing it and creating a world for the reader, it's the little details that matter so much. So you do find yourself like flipping through magazines from the time period or Sears catalog or newspapers. I have one of these Taschen books that I got on like I think used on Amazon or eBay or something. It's like one of these huge like books, but it's full of magazine references that have I get a sense of the time period and the clothing and all this stuff that it's kind of a coffee table book, which is why it's too expensive normally to buy it, but I found it used. So that's why it's like, but it's got so much in it that helps with just the period details. Um, so I think that a combination of all those things, like the world building with the concrete details and understanding the time period, finding resources, that help with the queer elements, all that, trying to do that. The thing I think you have to remember with writing historical is the story always needs to kind of be leading the way. You don't want to lapse into an essay on, Cold War politics. And there were certain things that I thought were important and I wanted to weave through, and I tried to get them through in different ways in dialogue. Sometimes I had to cut it back. But, in the Hall of Mirrors, we're dealing with sort of, the effects of the war in Korea, and of course all the Cold War stuff, all the Red Scare stuff that's sort of swirling around my characters. And they're indirectly involved with it. They're not in the government. They're just juxtaposed right next to it as civilians. And I've always taken that tactic. I'm not like a spy thriller guy. I love those books, but that's not what I do. I'm really a noir, puzzle mystery guy. But I think that I did want to sort of suggest that what the government does impact, the domestic lives of these characters. So there's some threads that kind of connect them.
Mhm.
But it's tricky. You can't just like, cough up an essay on, Cold War
Yeah.
politics.
Or the State Department or anything like that. Yeah.
Oh, definitely not.
I do have to ask because you have so many wonderful small details. Did Mamie Eisenhower really host a reception for cherry blossom people in Washington, D.C.?
I honestly, I think I made that up, but
Okay.
it is entirely possible. I mean, she did host events like that.
Uh,
So the idea that Mimi Eisenhower was hosting a luncheon for the, elite women of DC is, I think, certainly a
that's real
possibility.
possibility.
Um, but did it happen in the Mayflower and all this stuff? No, that's my own invention. But I thought I had to get sort of once again kind of glancing up next to a historical figure of some fascination.
Let's talk a little bit about your writing process because Hall of Mirrors, like your other books, is very intricate in its construction. There's a lot going on. In
Mhm.
fact, I thought I was very clever and smart because I had figured something out, and you pulled the rug out from underneath right at the end of the book, which was always fun as a mystery reader. But when you're writing these books, how do you start? Do you know these are things I have to put into the plot? I need to have clues. I need to have red herrings. I need to have suspects. Or do you just sit down and think, this is a story I want to tell and hope that it all comes together in the end?
Well, I think my over the years my process has changed a bit. I dodging and burning and Savage Kind, I kind of wrote into them a little bit. I had my characters, my basic situation, but I hadn't figured out everything. And for that reason, in both cases, I heavily revised the first 100 pages of Dodging and Burning, and I completely revised the Savage Kind because well, it had some point of view issues too. So I went from one point of view to two. And I before I published The Savage Kind, I decided that I really need to know what books two and three were about. And I did detailed outlines for both of them. And in doing those detailed outlines, I figured out essentially the mystery plot and how it was going to go. And for the third one as well. And I tell you, I don't think I'm ever turning back from writing that way. It just saves me a lot of time. And I'm always willing to break an outline if I feel like the characters want to do something else. I'm not a slave to that outline. I feel like I can break it, but to have it, and I think, and I do like these very intricate mysteries with lots of layers and points of view. And sometimes I want to kick myself because I'm like, what, John, why did you do this to yourself? But I do like it. I like it as a reader, I guess. So I'm always like, I'm writing for my ideal reader is me. And I want to write what I want to read. And so I think a lot of writers are this way. And so I like kind of the unfolding of different perspectives and shifting times and then having it all kind of gel in interesting ways. But yeah, I mean, it's tricky. I think there's a couple of things that's tricky about it. One is this the planting of clues and the working out of the logistics. And then there's like, that's one thing, like just how the crime happened. And the other thing is sort of how you're structuring the unveiling of the crime. So, where are you putting the clues so you're not giving away too much, but you're also playing fair. And I think those doing both those things, both I think can be tricky. And does require some revising and shifting of elements. Um, which is always a challenge.
In addition to writing yourself, you teach writing. And I'm kind of interested as a non-writer, if you're writing genre fiction, is a Masters of Fine Arts program really going to help you? Has it changed over the years? My perception was you went into those programs if you wanted to be John Updike, not Sue Grafton.
Yeah, so it's so interesting because I think when I received my MFA from George Mason back in the early 2000s, it was still very much what you're talking about. You would not bring a mystery story, or if you did, an eyebrow would be raised into your workshop. I always thought that was ridiculous. I even then thought it was ridiculous, but I was kind of I don't know, you
Rebel.
want to please your professors. So I wasn't going to do that. So I kept on bringing in like sort of these Gothic stories. There were, they were sort of literary, and so, but I mean, definitely there was a sort of idea that genre fiction of any sort, honestly, not just mystery fiction, was lowbrow. And I think there's still some of that around. I think a lot of it's changing, because certainly the program at Nebraska that I teach in, does not have that attitude at all. And frankly, most of my students want to write some form of genre. I do more work with world building than almost anything else. So whether it's, a fantasy world or a sci-fi world or a historical one, they don't want to write contemporary realism for the most part. And so, they're your customers ultimately. I want to stretch them if they only are writing sci-fi. I'm like, why don't you try something else, But you have to be aware that they're coming to this graduate program wanting to know how to do this kind of writing better. So I think my prediction is that for MFA programs to still stay vital, they're going to have to take on more popular fiction tracks or become more popular fiction focused, because that's where there's the books being published and the readers out there. Now, in my mind, let's take all that great like character stuff we learned and nuance and use of language from the MFA and apply it to the popular. Like there's no reason why you can't have both a great, they're not antithetical. They're in fact would be great to blend and pull together. So I'm always trying to both meet my students' needs, but also encourage them to grow in their certainly in what they read. I'm always saying you should read more crime books. and I think there's some great ones or whatever. But I think it's an interesting question. And I do think it's changing. I think it's going to have to change because of just the publishing climate. But so we'll see.
What's the best advice you would give to an aspiring writer?
Oh, I mean, the thing that always comes to my mind is, you do have to get ready to, you're going to have persistence and you're going to have patience. And don't sweat the rejections. It's hard, but the reality is that's if you're getting rejected, then you're moving in the right direction. If you're not submitting your work, whether it's, to a contest or to get into a literary conference or to get published or whatever, and you're not getting rejected, then you're not doing the work. And so embrace rejection, make it a badge of honor, and then know that it's about being persistent, and that it's ultimately building a career takes time. I think any career takes time. So see it as a career. Don't see it as I'm going to be having a bestseller, in 6 months. And be careful of people of looking at models of writers who that has happened to, because they're usually the exception, not the rule. Find other models who seem more like career writers, because I think, and there's some wonderful models, wonderful writers I admire. It's just a healthier and better way of looking at it. So hope that's useful.
I think it is good advice. Your own career, I'm sure there have been challenges because publishing readers, all different kinds of people like to put writers in a box. You're one kind of writer, you write one kind of
Yeah.
book. You can't be different things to different readers. And your books are mysteries, but they're also in some sense literature because you care about the writing, things like that. Does that make it more challenging as a writer to say, put your books in front of publishers?
Yeah, it does. I think it's been an ongoing challenge for people to know what to do with me. Because it was funny when I was shopping, dodging and burning around the first novel, it was always, this is too literary for the crime people, and this is too crimey for the literary people. And I was like, but they're both great, and you point to other writers who are doing the same thing, and you're like, but these guys, people seem to like these guys. People seem to like Tana French, people like Sarah Waters, et cetera, et cetera. And so you're always scratching your head a little bit why it's not seen as marketable, but it is. People do. It's not just that people want that publishers, I think sometimes want to put writers in certain, grooves. It's also because to not put them in a groove means extra work because you're going to have to think, how do I market this thing? But that doesn't mean there's not a market there. And being a queer crime writer, it is long told to the LGBTQ community that we were not viable for sales, and therefore get thee to the back of the bookstore, or you know. And you would not, it was a struggle, but I'm hoping that's changing some. Certainly in YA, that's changing. I hope to see more. I think it's kind of changing in horror. I think it's changing in thriller and that kind of thing. Where it's like, it's not more people want to read these books than just identify as, LGBTQ. I mean, there are a
Yeah.
lot of the straight audience for these things, and hallelujah, that's wonderful. That's what we want because they're just great stories. And so I think, but convincing publishers of some of those things can be a challenge. And I think even when you are publishing, trying to help figure out how to promote this thing. And I've realized over time that I just needed to step in as a writer and say, I think I know how to promote this because I've connected to the community of readers. So, if you have a publisher, and I'm lucky enough to have a great publisher who kind of listens and wants to have a conversation about those things, I think it's really can be quite powerful. And so I think it's like figuring anything else out. It's not that people don't want it, it's just how to get it to them. And so yeah, but it's always a challenge. Honestly, it's a challenge to market any fiction in general. So I get that I get why that there's some hesitation, but I do think also good books rise to the surface. And if I think my books are good books. I
Yeah.
think that you just have to stick to it. The advice I gave just a minute ago about perseverance is just advice I'm continuing to take. So
I think you're right. I think there is hope from the bookstore perspective. 4 years ago, I don't think you could count on the fingers of one hand the number of sapphic romances you could find being
mhm.
published, and it's the hottest thing in romance now. So you just have to wait for things to have their moment in the sun. Let's
Yeah.
talk a little bit about you as a reader, because one of the other things I loved about Hall of Mirrors is it's almost a love letter to classic Golden Age mysteries. Is that something you're imparting into your characters that comes from you? What was your own reading experiences like? I love seeing the references to Christie because I think it's Lionel and Roger actually meet when one of them's reading an Agatha Christie novel.
Right, right, right. I yes, I adore. I mean, this should be no surprise. I adore Agatha Christie. Most of us do. And I think, there's just something about the structure of a golden age mystery. And I think Christie, in my mind, just does it. And for me, for my taste, one of the best because she is careful. She makes a very intricate puzzle mystery, but she's always careful in the best of her books to really have a lot of emotional heft behind that. And I think that there is an emotional kind of in these characters. There's something there that's that it's not just about clues and a sleight of hand, but it's also about the emotions of the characters coming to play in that. And so I'm very interested in these two things, like the shape of a mystery plot and why as humans we're very attracted to that because and I'm not so sure I have lots of answers for this, but I do think there's something about unlocking a mystery and being surprised and having sort of the rug pulled out from underneath you that is interestingly, it's humbling in an exciting way, And there's something awe-inspiring about that. Like this moment of like, what? And I remember I don't know how old I was, maybe like 10 or 11, sitting, this is before I was really, I was reading still pretty young books, but I remember sitting and watching Death on the Nile.
Mhm.
And it was basically the first thing like that I had seen. And I was just like, my jaw dropped I was like, oh my gosh, I thought it was like the most, amazing thing. So that feeling of surprise or a little bit of awe that happens in a mystery, I think, is always going to be attractive to me. I think I'm always going to want to do that in some way. Because I think there's always going to be a mystery. Even if I'm not writing a mystery, it's going to have some of those elements in it, because those moments are so important to me as a reader.
Are there certain contemporary crime fiction writers that when their books come out, you would drop everything to pick up a new book?
Oh boy. Well, I think that I read around a lot. I think at this point I'm so focused on reading and sort of getting a real sense of a lot of the queer crime writers that are working and being really innovative. That I think those are the books that I'm reaching for. I also read a lot of other like uh, books that aren't crime fiction and nonfiction and that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, like Margot Dwyer, I think she's just so smart in what she's doing with her books, or Robin Geigel. They're taking this sort of genre elements which we know, but then they're doing something new with them with the queer characters in them. So you know. I think probably me and the rest of the world would stop to read an S.A. Cosby book, or it's not, I'm not writing noir like that, but it's just, you just fly through it. It's just so good. And his language is really compelling. And so I think that Wanda Morris and,
Mhm.
Kelly Garrett and Alex Segura, a lot of these guys, I just think there's a lot of innovation happening. But I'm also just feel drawn, and so there's so much great stuff going on. You're like, I'll read this and then I'll read that. And then, I rarely just get in a groove with a writer and read all the way through, unless they're sort of, I feel like there's an end to their catalog. I tend to bounce around a lot. So
In addition to reading and writing, you have other projects that you're involved with. Can you tell us a little bit about queer crime fiction writers?
yeah, so Queer Crime Writers is an organization that I started with Kristen Olympionka, actually, like I think 2019, and then the pandemic happened and nothing kind of happened with it. And then and several others, Jeff Marks, and we have some other folks that have gotten involved as well. And its mission is really to support and promote, writers who identify as LGBTQIA plus. It's not necessarily that the content of their books has to have it, but that they're writing crime fiction and they identify that way. And we have a website where we feature those authors. The idea being is that if we feature them and people are looking to include these kinds of writers in their programming, or their anthologies or that kind of thing, they can find those writers easily. We also have an internal group where we can chat and talk about that sort of stuff. We meet up at conferences and stuff and have, happy hours and that kind of thing. So to build some community as well. We're very much, in the process of building our presence. One thing that I've been really involved with is writing a quarterly roundup for crime reads that features those writers. So every season the books coming out that are queer crime writers will be featured in crime reads, and very thankful to them for supporting us that way. But it's cool. We're hoping to grow. We've certainly used the model of crime writers of color who have had such success, in forming these organizations, just to raise awareness and support each other.
About House of Mystery radio show. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so this happened. Al Warren interviewed me for House of Radio. He's the mastermind behind House of Radio. I mean, excuse me, House of Mystery Radio show. And he reached out to me and interviewed me, and he asked me if I wanted to co-host occasionally. There's several co-hosts, and we kind of pop on and support the conversation and these radio interviews, which are also, of course, you can listen in podcast form. And it's been really fun. I've just been able to interview all sorts of writers, like from big heavy hitters to small guys getting their start. I love that about the program. He doesn't sort of just go after the big names. He really mixes it up, and so you just learn and you get a sense of all these different writers and what they're kind of thinking about and dipping into different kinds of writing. I've interviewed some true crime folks. It's not just mystery writers or fiction writers. So I think that's like it's a fun. I've grown a lot through doing that, and it's really a fun sort of element of my creative life as well. And you learn a lot.
I'm wondering if you kind of gave that same affection you have for it to Judy when she goes to work at the radio station in Hall of Mirrors.
Yeah, I did. I did. I was like, this is literally life is starting to, which it does, sort of inform your fiction. And I really had fun sort of taking her into the radio station and and thinking about that, the fact that they wouldn't necessarily have female radio announcers and there's a lot of stuff going on in the novel where these characters are trying to push through in areas that they weren't normally allowed in spaces or jobs that weren't normally allowed in. And she, of course, gets a chance to do that, which turns out to be kind of a plot point as well. But it was also interesting about that time period. It's like the end of the big radio era and the beginning of the TV. And just to sort of realize that was such a big shift for folks. And we go through our tech shifts here, and I feel like to think about that kind of shift, now that we're dealing with AI and all this stuff, we're going through another one right now, so
Yeah, you're
God
right.
help us.
Um, People that are used to watching the news on three channels now, most people get their news on social media. So it's a whole big change in things.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
You've mentioned it a little bit, and feel free to say as much or as little as you'd like, but there's a third book coming. What can we know about that?
Yeah, yeah. So hopefully coming. I have it planned. Hope Pegasus wants it. Yeah, it is tentatively titled Goddess of Love. And takes Judy and Philippa to 1963. So we're dealing with a slightly different time period and a big leap in years. And it begins with Judy having received a substantial inheritance, but it is an inheritance that, while a lot of money is also comes with a cursed past. I won't say too much; I'll give stuff away. But
Mhm.
and it's a lot about the two women kind of, if it's not, I'm not really giving anything away because you kind of know this is the end of the Savage Kind, but they fall apart, they fall out ultimately in those intervening years. So what happened? How does that kind of resolve itself when they get back together? Um, and what I like thematically to think about, the Savage Kind is sort of the characters figuring out who they are. The Hall of Mirrors is really about these characters trying to figure out how they sort of present and who they are in the world. And this last book is really about sort of the inheritance of the people that came before you and how you deal with the long shadow of some of that. And so yeah, it has some nice twists in it. So I'm really excited I have it outlined, so I'm really excited to see how it, turns out on the page, if given the opportunity.
How can readers learn more about your books? Are you on social media?
Yes, I am. These days, all the time. I am, yeah, I'm on Instagram at John Cope 74 and Twitter and Facebook. You can find me John Cope author. It's almost all John Copenhaver. It's only Instagram, it's a little different. I'm also on TikTok and all these various different things. But you can also find me on my website, which is just www.johncopenhaver.com. So I'm easy to find.
Well, that's great. I can't believe how quickly our time has flown by. We've been very fortunate at the Poison Pen to have with us today award-winning author John Copenhaver. His new book is Hall of Mirrors. It's out or will soon be available near you in bookstores and libraries. I'd like to thank John for taking time to share his literary knowledge and insight with us, and for all of you tuning in to another virtual event. Thank you for joining us at the Poison Pen.
Thank you so much for having me, John.
Thank you. Now I'm going to try clicking on things because I'm not the tech person. So if I lose you, you were terrific. Thank you. Really enjoyed the
All right,
book.
thank you so
Wait for
much
the
for
third.
what'd
Thank
you
you.
say? I'm
Oh,
sorry.
I really enjoyed it. Can't wait for the third.
Oh
There's a
yeah, I need to get
yeah.
to work.
You did surprise me, which I like as a mystery reader. So thank you.
Good, good. That's exciting. I'm hearing that from some folks. You're living in this world for so long that the twist ceases to become a twist for you, and so you're like,
Yeah, I can imagine it seems, but yeah, it was clever. Okay, I'm clicking and I'm looking for things.